Some days it's getting hard to write because of what's going on in my country. As the oligarchs fire workers from their jobs, I expect we will soon see skyrocketing unemployment. As the oligarchs dismantle government programs designed to care for the poor, the needy, and those with special needs, the underprivileged, they create the conditions to cast more working class people into those categories. What can I do? Not much. I have very little power. But what I can do is stand up and use my voice.
Stand up and use your voice.
To expose the corruption at the head of my government. To demonstrate the power base of that person, how utterly he stands against the very principles that Christians claim to live by. This government isn't out to stand up for the God you love. It's out to use you and your desire to hold on to a power that you think you deserve. And when he has achieved taking complete control, he will cast you aside just as he has cast aside every supporter of his that didn't pledge loyalty to him and him alone. Don't believe me? Look at his first term in office. How many chiefs of staff did he go through? How many secretaries of state? How many attorneys general? He wasn't loyal to his friends and supporters, only to himself. He has no loyalty to your God either, only to himself. And when your God is no longer useful to him, he will cast away your God too, and demand loyalty to him, even against your God and your Christian principles. When the time comes, which will you choose? So why are Christians in this boat? Why are they supporting a thrice-divorced, porn star-loving, wife-cheating, 34 times convicted felon, liar like Donald Trump? Because they feel that they are losing power in the United States that used to be a bastion for Christianity, or so they think. Today we'll be looking at a bit of history, as well as Sean McDowell interviewing a recent convert. The interview will demonstrate how desperate Christians are becoming to claim that their God is not becoming irrelevant in today's culture. In so doing, I think we can find hope for the future. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Christians are no different from anyone else. Once they have power, they don't want to lose it, because men, above all else, desire power, or so someone said.
And nine rings were gifted to the race of men, who above all else desire power.
What I find ironic is Donald Trump uses the religious right to gain and hold power, and the religious right uses Donald Trump to try to regain a power they feel they are losing. But the power believers in the United States try so desperately to cling to isn't as ingrained in U.S. culture and history as they would have their followers believe. The Founding Fathers did not found this country on Judeo-Christian values, as they claim. And to anyone who claims otherwise, ask them when it was ever a value of our Founding Fathers that Yahweh was to be worshipped and He alone was to be served. A few of the colonies were founded as theocracies, and church attendance and membership were required for full citizenship. However, by the time of the American Revolution, such laws had begun to disappear, and those that were still left were rarely enforced. Establishing a federal church would have jeopardized the new union. The New England colonies generally supported congregational churches, while the Middle Atlantic and Southern colonies possessed Episcopalian establishments. Even if the Founding Fathers had not believed in separation of church and state, which church was to be established? The only way Episcopal and congregational churches could federate with Presbyterians, Baptists, and other small groups was on a basis of church-state separation. Article 6, prohibiting a religious test for office, was the offspring of this neutralism. And while it can be argued that this is still Judeo-Christian principles, such an argument would be wrong. Tolerance of differences in theology has never been a Judeo-Christian principle. Just look at Deuteronomy 13 and what it has to say about what one is to do to even family that entice you to worship differently. And while it could be argued that this was referring to other gods, not other sects of the Christian faith, I would ask whether Christians have ever in history been tolerant of even other Christians that disagreed with their theology. The Catholics and Protestants have made war with each other numerous times over the centuries. The Crusades sought to wrest the Holy Land from the Muslims, who founded their religion on the same Abrahamic text as the Jewish religion. The Inquisition and Salem witch trials put to death those that were accused of not complying with the Christian theology of the ones in power. Tolerance of differences in theology has only recently become a Judeo-Christian value. We continue to see intolerance for other Christian theologies even today, as the progressive church is vilified by Donald Trump and the religious right. Not that Trump cares what Bishop Buddy believes or that her theology aligns with his, if he even has a theology. All he cares about is that she asks for compassion for the LGBTQ community.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you, and as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives.
Something Donald Trump has no intention of doing. He was so vehemently opposed to the idea that he demanded an apology from her. Let that sink in. Asking for an apology for asking for mercy. Is that who your Jesus is? One who, when asked for mercy, instead of giving mercy, demands an apology for even asking? Whatever happened to "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy"? For the first time in U.S. history, remember the theocratic colonies were not the United States. Religious freedom is under attack, and it's under attack from the highest levels of our government. Why am I concerned when I have no religion? Because if the U.S. is about to become a theocracy, those of us with no religion will be the first to be targeted. Maybe I can hide behind Christian claims that evolution is a religion. Look, I have a religion. Science could be my God. Oh, merciful science, please come and rescue us in our hour of need. But seriously, has Christianity ever been the religion in the United States? No, not now and not ever. Levels of church attendance and numbers of adherents to the Christian faith has risen and fallen several times in our nation's history. By the end of the colonial period, Protestant rationalism was the dominant religious force among the leaders of most of the colonies. Whether Unitarian, Deist, or even Anglican Congregational, rationalism focused on the ethical aspects of religion. Rationalism also discarded many superstitious aspects of Christian liturgy, although many continued to believe in the human soul and the afterlife. The political edge of this argument was that no human institution, religious or civil, could claim divine authority. In their search for God's truth, rationalists such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin valued the study of nature, known as natural religion, over the scriptures, or revealed religion. Next time a believer tells you that the Declaration of Independence shows a reliance on Judeo-Christian values because of the term nature's God, remind them that Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the document, considered nature's God to be merely the study of nature, not an actual God. In colonial America, no more than 10 to 20% of the people belonged to a church. In 1850, only 25 to 35% of Americans were church members, with the majority remaining outside of churches until the 20th century, according to D. Michael Quinn. Church membership didn't take off until the 1950s. The 1950s brought us the post-war baby boom and the Red Scare. Fear of Russia's nuclear arsenal had Americans pledging allegiance to the flag and fearing atheist Russia. Senator Joseph McCarthy built on this fear, creating the Committee on Un-American Activities to root out communist sympathizers. It led to innocent people's lives being ruined by accusations of being communist, illustrated aptly by Arthur Miller in the play The Crucible, ostensibly about the Salem witch trials, but in reality, a commentary on McCarthyism. To demonstrate their patriotism and the rejection of atheist communism, the words "under God" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the words "in God we trust" was added to our money. Now the current generation is under the misguided notion that these words have been there all along. Ironically, the current administration is aligning itself with communist Russia, and Christians attempt to get reciting the Pledge of Allegiance back into schools, a complete rejection of Russian ideals and principles. That isn't all that was going on in the 1950s, however. Two other major events were the Korean War and the Civil Rights Movement.
You can see the horses, you can see them, they were ready. Their shoes was shiny, they had everything. Nobody expected Sunday to be bloody because the cameras was there, the whole world was watching.
Whenever believers start pining for the good old days of the 50s when they think church and family were the most important values, I point out that those values included racial segregation and race riots. They were only the good old days if you were white, male, and straight. But this is the delusion, the revisionist history that Christians want to try to return us to, a history of nearly everyone believing in their God, adhering to their principles, and attending the Christian church of their choice, a history that has never existed in this country, as at best, church membership has never been greater than about 50%. At its peak in 1972, 90% of Americans identified as Christians. This began to fall rapidly in about 1975, and now is down to about 62%. Many factors have gone into the decline, but one factor is the internet. Pastors can no longer make bold, unsubstantiated claims from the pulpit without being fact-checked on the spot by the younger generation in the pews. This decline in belief has Christians scrambling to find people who convert to the faith, finding it relevant and meaningful to them, giving hope to the faithful their message can still garner attention. And that's where we find ourselves today, with Sean McDowell interviewing Dr. Larry Sanger, co-founder of Wikipedia. His interview is over an hour in length, so I'll just be taking a few snippets. Unlike the conversion of Aylin Hersey Alley, Sanger claims that his conversion includes an acceptance of the theology. But does it? I'll let Sean give us his guest's bio.
Why would the co-founder of Wikipedia, a skeptic for 35 years, who earned a PhD in philosophy from the Ohio State University, become a Christian? How did he originally lose his faith as a teenager? And then what were the arguments and experiences that led him back to faith in his 50s?
His story is almost the opposite of mine. I noted the inclusion of experiences in Larry's conversion. Is this an admission that the arguments and evidence on their own are not enough? If so, there is no hope for the billions for whom there is no religious experience.
I didn't want to go out into the public and to loudly declare myself without being able to defend doctrine, both theology and the Bible. So, and I have studied both quite a bit in the last 5 years. So I'm not saying that I'm ready.
Of course.
Oh, but I'll do my best.
Dr. Sanger is going to defend the faith for us. He spent 5 years now studying it, and he's going to present his newfound belief to the world.
Oh, you're going to do great. I've always kind of wondered what kind of mind created Wikipedia. And then when I've read your account and how much you love truth, seek truth, research, I'm like, now it makes sense.
I love truth too. That's why I'm no longer a Christian. The theology cannot possibly be true. Just take the claims that God is love, God wants everyone to believe, and that all things are possible for God, and Christianity falls right there. If it were true that God loved all and wanted all to believe, and could do all things, then everyone should believe. All the claims about, but free will, don't cut it. Can God do all things or not? If God can do all things, then that should include finding a way to tell everyone about himself without violating free will. If he can't do that, then he can't do all things. If he can do that but chooses not to, he can't claim he wants all to believe and loves all people. I made up this little chart in response to a post that Sean made on Twitter about a year ago. I don't even remember exactly what the topic was now. It's a bit simplistic, but you get the idea. So why does Larry Sanger think that the God claims of the Bible are true?
I withheld the proposition. That's what philosophers say. So I neither affirmed nor denied that God exists. I said, essentially, I don't know.
So Larry was never an unbeliever. He simply wasn't a believer either. By Sean's and most Christians' definition of an unbeliever, that would make him an unbeliever, as they define anyone who is not a believer as an unbeliever. But, according to Jesus, anyone who is not against him is for him. If Jesus ever said any of this, if Jesus ever existed, goodness, my list of caveats is getting long. So according to Christianity, Larry was always a Christian, or at least he was always for Jesus. On the other hand, Jesus also said, allegedly, whoever is not for me is against me, in which case Larry was never a Christian, as he wasn't for Jesus. Nothing like covering all the bases so that no matter what someone says, you can pull out a Bible verse that supports your position, no matter what that position happens to be. So take your pick. Larry was always a believer. Larry was never a believer. You can support either one from the Bible.
Or I haven't made up my mind. I will say, though, that I didn't think too much about it.
Yep, you had no reason to. It wasn't relevant to your life. What changed? Oh, and the expression on Sean's face is precious here.
I just was unconvinced. I thought that the arguments were not very good.
Which is exactly where I stand today. What changed your mind? Larry then gives his background, which was that his parents were Lutheran, and he went to church every Sunday until he was 10 or 12, when his parents got divorced, and then they stopped going. He was confirmed and went to Vacation Bible School.
I asked a lot of questions, but I did not get a lot of guidance in answering them. I got some.
Typical. Larry, do you now think you have any answers to those questions?
But I was told by various people in my life that I asked too many questions.
Shouldn't that be enough to tell you that there aren't any answers? If there were answers, there should be no such thing as too many questions.
So at this point, when you've graduated with a PhD, you've kind of left your faith behind. You're not thinking about it a ton. What did you make of the arguments for God's existence?
When I was in graduate school, I had both studied them as an undergraduate and taught them to undergraduates. And I thought that they were pretty lightweight.
Have they put on a few pounds since then?
I didn't know of any. Well, let's put it this way. I took these matters seriously, and I would at least seriously enough to do more than just read the books that I was teaching out of, but actually look at some of the deeper, more advanced source material. And whenever I did that, I never really found anything that addressed the sorts of issues that I had.
So what have you now found that does? Or have you just put aside your issues because you want it to be true?
There's one general thing that I came back to, although each different argument had problems of its own on my view. But in general, none of the arguments actually established, even if you grant the premises, none of them seem to establish the ultimate conclusion that God exists.
Precisely. The Kalam gets you to a universe that had a beginning. The fine-tuning argument should only get you to that we don't know if any other conditions could have existed, if any other universes exist, if life could have developed in a universe with different parameters, but a different form from life suited to those parameters. Pascal's wager gets you to bet that there is a God, but with no evidence that there actually is one. The moral argument and the argument from consciousness leave you in a similar place as the fine-tuning argument. We don't know all the factors that went into the development of morals or consciousness, but that again doesn't mean that a God made them. So what changed Dr. Sanger's mind?
Like that, the first cause argument. All it does is establish that there was a first cause outside of the universe that caused the universe to come into being. And this we call God that comes at the end? That's an enormous leap. It doesn't follow. I still think that. It's true. It doesn't follow.
Cool. Even as a believer, he still sees the Kalam doesn't get you to a God, let alone the Christian God.
There's a lot of other things that you need to say before you can draw that conclusion. But it's a very important conclusion, I now think. It's very important that we be able to say that there was a first cause, or that there is a causal explanation of different elements in the universe.
I'll grant that. There was a first cause. What was that cause? I have no idea. Could it have been a God? Sure, that's possible. But is it probable? No, it isn't. Could it have been the Christian God? Absolutely not. Why not? Because the Christian God is logically impossible. Succinctly, it is impossible for a triumni God to exist in a world that has unnecessary suffering and to hide from those that earnestly seek him.
One of my heroes in epistemology, a guy who influenced my dissertation a lot, is William Alston.
Yeah.
And I got my hands on a book called Perceiving God. And I didn't read the whole thing, maybe just the first couple of chapters, and I just found myself mystified because he seemed to presuppose a religious experience that I didn't have, which is okay, because that's the nature of that kind of argument. That kind of argument, what it does is it's an attempt to understand the religious experiences that people have.
So you were seeking to understand an experience you didn't have yourself. I'm probably getting a bit ahead here, but I'm wondering why a God that loves all would give such experiences to some and not others. Especially, why would a God that condemns people to an eternity in hell withhold such an experience from both those that earnestly seek him and from the non-resistant non-believer? Did you, Dr. Sanger, have an experience at this point?
Right? So it's based on the premise that people have a certain kind of religious experience. I didn't have that religious experience at all. I said, well, maybe in the future I will have such a religious experience myself. And then, maybe I'll have a reason to believe that I don't now have. That's what I told myself.
So you're open to it, sounds like, which is great.
So he was a middle-aged, non-resistant non-believer from whom God was hidden. God decided, for whatever reason, that he had no use for Dr. Sanger and thus didn't choose to reveal himself.
Maybe I'm not really being properly intellectually honest about the possible case that could be made for Christianity. And I'm just too glibly and easily assuming that that there's nothing to the arguments.
Fair point. After all, they were developed by greater minds than mine. However, as you pointed out earlier, they don't even get you to a God, let alone the Christian God. Surely this cannot be what convinced you that not only there was a God, but that the God was the Christian God?
I never would have thought that it would be reading the Bible that would give me a new perspective on the traditional arguments for the existence of God. It's like, how would that help me? But it did. I mean, it's like it opened my eyes in so many different ways.
Interesting, as reading the Bible is what turned so many of us atheists against the idea of the Christian God being real. What initially caused me to question the existence of God is the story of the conversion of Paul. At this point, I wasn't even aware of the inconsistencies between the different accounts in the story.
One of the things that Ayn Rand is famous for is the so-called virtue of selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
And really what this amounts to is, yes, we have obligations to other people, and we ought to treat them with justice and so forth, but that ultimately can only be um, justified in terms of our own self-interest. In other words, it's ultimately good for me to treat others with justice,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. Um, and even I thought, even to do good for other people. And maybe it's because, I don't know, makes us feel good, or, well, there's more to it than that. But at
Sure.
any rate, okay. Then I had a wife, and after 5 years, I had a child,
Mm.
and I reflected, from time to time that I would die for these people, of
Mm.
course. Uh, and then that raises the question: if I'm willing to die for them, then what is the ethical egoism justification of that? It isn't in my self-interest, it's in their interest, and I am
Mm.
deliberately placing their interest ahead of mine.
False. Preserving your offspring is in your best interests. Dawkins explains this in his book The Selfish Gene, how species preservation is self-preservation. One preserves oneself by passing down one's genes to offspring that survive. If you survive but your wife and child do not, you do not pass down your genes and your legacy ends with you. You need to look at yourself not just as what you are here and now, but who you are in the future. Your offspring are your future. They are your legacy. You cannot live forever in the form that you are in now, but you can pass down yourself in the form of your genes. Christianity tries to capitalize on the desire to have a legacy, except it promises to give you life in your current form forever. Not exactly your current form. Your body will die, but it promises the preservation of your soul, the essence of who you are. Problematic for that view is the theology that you will be forever happy in that form, even if your loved ones are being tortured in hell forever. But is that really you? If you are willing to die for your wife and child, are you willing to trade places with them and burn in hell so that they can be in heaven? Could you ever be happy in heaven knowing that they are in hell? If so, it isn't you that is in heaven. It's a remade version of you that doesn't have the love that you do for your wife and your child. Is this really you? If not, can you honestly say that your salvation in this religion gets you into heaven, as salvation and heaven are supposed to be the ultimate rewards for this belief? And of course, there is always the ultimate question of why a good God would condemn anyone to an eternity of torture, but especially when the admission price out is a belief that that God intentionally hid from you or your loved ones. Do you believe in hell, Dr. Sanger? Or have you believed in a form of Christianity that doesn't include eternal torture? Is hell a real place, or is belief in hell optional? If it's optional, then it can't be real. Now apply that to the Christian God. Is belief in all of the Bible required, or can you choose which parts you believe? Is your God one that would allow slavery and order the genocide of the Amalekites, or do you pick and choose which aspects of the Christian God to hold to? If so, can you say this God is real, or does he only exist in your mind?
I said, well, Ayn Rand was wrong about that. And therefore, uh, maybe she was wrong about other things as well.
Or maybe she didn't have the whole picture of what self-interest could entail.
What got you to the point then where you're like, all right, I got to study the Bible? And I think you describe it as like careful and obsessively wanting to study it. What
Mhm.
shifted where you had that mindset and you're like, I'm all in to understand this?
I'm not sure I ever really understood why I got so obsessed with it. Maybe I was led by the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
Um, but um, I, I mean, at first I was just going to read it for bedtime reading. And I did that for maybe 3 or 4 days. But then, like, it was so fascinating.
Hmm.
I actually read parts, the same part that I read to my son a few years before, and had made no impression of this sort at all.
Interesting. So the Bible itself makes no impression. It must be coupled with something you can't identify that could possibly be the Holy Spirit. If that's the case, one can't know God unless God chooses to reveal himself. And again, why did he wait so long with you? And more importantly, why does he never reveal himself to many who ardently seek him? If he wants believers, why hide from the non-resistant? I go further. Why hide from the resistant? Paul allegedly was resistant, yet allegedly Jesus appeared to him in a convincing vision. If God can do this for Paul, the resistant non-believer, why not everyone? If the world would really be a better place if all believed, why not just make himself plain to all? And I don't mean by making a tree. No one has ever looked at a tree and come away with an understanding of Christianity from seeing a tree. Christianity is as clear as the bark on the tree if all you know about it is you looked at a tree.
But this time I was doing something different, because I said, okay, look, I'm not just like reading this to my son so he's familiar with like the verbiage and the concepts and the characters and so forth. No, I actually want to understand it on its own terms. I actually wanted to understand what the Christians believe. All right. And this meant, and this is something I would insist on strongly now, that if you're going to study the Bible and understand it, you have to understand it the way that the people who believe it understand it, not the way that modern scholars understand it.
First, I'm going to let a real Bible scholar respond to that and then give you my thoughts. Kipp Davis has graciously provided me with this response.
So Larry Sanger says that we should understand the Bible the way people understood it on his own terms. He starts by saying that he wants to understand what the Christians believe. So I have several questions and concerns here. How do we come to understand the Bible on its own terms? What does this mean with regards to its original composition, its sources? These things lead scholars to hypothesizing about circumstances and conditions and under which these texts were written, as well as their reception and their redaction. So how do modern scholars understand the Bible, and why? The principal methods that scholars use in evaluating biblical literature can be subsumed under a technical term, basically as the historical critical method. And this was developed from observations as far back as the 17th century by Baruch or Benedict Spinoza. The historical critical method is basically a set of tools used by experts in their efforts to stop privileging the Bible over and against other literature, and just to treat it as we would any ancient text. There's a scholar of the ancient Near East by the name of Kenton Sparks, and he's developed or promoted what he identifies as 3 axioms or 3 criteria of the historical critical method. The first of these he calls historical context. He says that ancient texts are best understood when they are set within their own culture and language and against a relevant religious, political, and economic backdrop. What this means for the Bible is that individual writings within this rather expansive collection are best understood in accordance with a variety of contributing factors, not all of which are the same for every text. The second point is historical analogy. Historical analogy recognizes that the patterns of life are pretty static. Natural laws govern the world that we know, and they form the basis of our understanding of events and circumstances. So when we read history, we assume that the same causes and effects which govern our world have also been active at all times and in all places. So then, every effort is made to provide a naturalistic interpretation as a point of departure and to give first priority to readings of the text through this lens. This means that where a text assumes divine interventions or supernatural agency, we will explore the limitations of nature to explain what is known to have happened before ruling these sorts of things out. The third point is historical criticism. Investigations of historical claims should be undertaken from a perspective of what is often called Cartesian doubt. That is, the systematic process of assuming methodological skepticism in the process of sorting true and false claims about history. So when reading ancient accounts of the past, our analyses should start from a skeptical disposition. This means first calling into question all interpretive claims and then attempting to establish their value from a more sober evaluation of several streams of evidence. And this isn't something that we do just for the Bible. I need to repeat that. These are axioms, these are principles that we use in our evaluation of all sorts of ancient literature. It's useful even for sorting through claims of modern literature. So how did the ancient Hebrews understand the Bible? I mean, who are we talking about? Which ancient Hebrews? When? So there was no Bible until after the time of Jesus. What we have prior to the time of Jesus are various collections of individual Hebrew texts that were valued by different Jewish communities. There's not even any evidence of attempts to create a Torah, the Pentateuch, sort of the first layer, the first collection of biblical texts. There's no evidence for even attempts to create anything like this until the 3rd century BCE. So Hebrew Bible texts range wildly in date and context. The earliest literature in the Hebrew Bible promotes cultural ideologies of tribal Canaanite society and this war god Yahweh, who crushed his enemies and rescued and secured the heritage of his people. But then we see much later post-exilic texts who consider this same God as universal, all-powerful, distant, cosmically concerned about their own marginalization and persecution. If you read the text closely, you're going to start to see many of these deeply contrasting differences just within the text itself. It's just naive to accept that all these texts on their face value are univocal or consistent in drawing pictures and making presentations of who God is or who even the people of Israel were and what happened to them. So, how did ancient Christians understand the Bible? Again, who are we talking about here? Which ancient Christians? When? Much like Hebrews, there were also varieties of Christian ideologies. But quite unlike the early Hebrews, Christians read these texts, these ancient Hebrew texts, through their own interpretive lens that was often very strained and historically, culturally, or textually bankrupt. There's a lot of problems with the ways in which the early church, in which the New Testament writers just read the Jewish scriptures. So none of these groups understood the Bible in the same ways as one another, and absolutely none of them understood the Bible like modern Christians like Larry Sanger. I mean, it's just rich that Sanger flatly dismisses scholarship because he hasn't done the work. He hasn't learned the languages. He hasn't read the contemporary literature and maybe learned those languages as well. He hasn't learned anything about history, archaeology, anthropology. He doesn't understand the rich dynamics in literature or intertextuality, the relationship of these texts to one another in this rich, dynamic, cross-cultural matrix through which so much of this ancient literature developed. So Dr. Sanger has not weighed all the sources accordingly, and as a result of that, it's kind of insulting for him to just flatly dismiss the hard work of scholars in the field who do.
Dr. Sanger, listen to yourself. Don't read the Bible the way it is read by people who spend a lifetime studying it. Read it instead with the understanding of the layperson who has never done such study. Would you recommend that approach to anyone in any other subject? Don't read Shakespeare the way the scholars who have studied it and read it. Read it like a layperson who doesn't understand the poetry, the history, the structure, and so forth. Would you recommend that your students throw out the works of the great philosophers and just look at the way a philosophy student would? Read the works of armchair philosophers, not Nietzsche, Descartes, Aquinas, or Socrates? Of course not. Ignoring the work of the experts in the field and looking instead at what lay people see can make for an interesting experiment, but it is certainly no way to study any subject. Worse, lay people don't agree on what the Bible means. A prime example is my question to you on hell. Different people have differing views on hell. They differ on how worship is to be done, who can be saved, whether Jesus was always God or became God at some point, if man evolved or was a special creation, if the Bible says the world is a mere 6,000 years old, how to treat the LGBTQ community, how and when to take communion, confession, how to pray, and so on. Which believers are you going to approach, presupposing that their view is the right one? And how did you pick that group? Let me guess. You picked the Lutherans, because that was the church you were raised in and believed in at a young age? It sounds to me like you traded reason for presuppositionalism. My big question is, why?
Because they're wrong. They don't take it the way the ancient Hebrews did, the ancient Christians did, or modern Christians do.
Wow. All Bible scholars are wrong. They don't know their own field. They don't ask how the ancient Christians or Hebrews believed or how modern Christians do. Dude, what do you think Bible scholars do? This is a young earth creation level of denial. Sanger makes the claim that the Bible scholars don't know how to study the Bible, just as young earth creationists claim that biologists don't understand biology. Dr. Sanger, if one of your students said that you don't understand philosophy because you don't read Plato the way an unschooled student does, would you find that to be a fair critique? I think you would tell that student to leave and not come back until he's ready to learn. If you have to close your mind to the scholars and only listen to what lay people determine the Bible means, can you honestly say that you have studied this? Or did you just take an interpretation you like and run with it, dismissing any who disagree?
So I actually used gotquestions.org, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great.
It's a good website. It's got, I mean, it's very, reformed, but it's got a lot of solid stuff in it, a lot of good answers, and my hat is off to those guys.
Did any of those questions answer the question that you had about the existence of God? Or did you push those questions away to presuppose that God does in fact exist?
and plenty of videos. Might have watched a video of yours at some point.
Okay.
You know, and and so forth. I would like ask a question. So I think that actually is what did it, right? Because
Mm,
it was my intention merely to understand. But
mm,
then when I started doing that, became really interesting.
mm,
And the thing that was amazing to me, the more I actually looked up answers to my questions, which initially I didn't necessarily believe. I was just acquainting myself with the answers, you know. Um, but what I was amazed to discover is that the 2,000-year-old history of theology had been asking and answering these questions, and their answers, at least given sort of modern formulations that were palatable to me, they actually made sense.
mm.
You know, they weren't incoherent.
So gotquestions.org made sense in answering your questions. Philosophy failed you. Your own field of study could not give you sound reasoning, but this website did. Let's see what it says about the existence of God. A certain amount of faith is necessary, and not just regarding God's existence. Perfect knowledge is beyond our ability. Bias and prejudice cloud our views. There will always be a gap between what we know and what we believe. Evidence of God exists in daily human experiences. So if you presuppose that the Bible is true and have faith that it is so, then you can conclude that God exists. How is this sound reasoning? How did this answer your questions? It certainly doesn't answer mine. This includes our innate sense of morality. It applies to the apparent design of the universe around us. This evidence that they present is the same arguments you didn't find persuasive earlier in life. Now you decided to presuppose that they get you to a God, and voila, you now believe that there is a God. Unbelievable, pun intended. Human life compels belief that truth, deception, love, hate, goodness, evil, etc. are real and meaningful. The overwhelming majority of people throughout history have been inclined to believe in a reality greater than the physical. I agree that there are things that are not physical, like the things that you listed there, but these things don't have existence. There's a difference between existing and having existence. Music exists. We can hear it. We can experience it. But it doesn't have existence. It doesn't have objective reality or being. It can't be found, especially in a particular place or situation. You can't look at things that don't have existence to conclude that there is a God that does have existence. If a God had existence, we should be able to find evidence of him in the material universe. Yet we don't. If you want to make the claim that God is like love, existing, but not having existence, fine, I'll agree to that. But that gets you to a God that exists only in your head and isn't real. Is that where you want to go? God is whatever people say God is because God has no real existence? If so, welcome back to skepticism. Then Got Questions goes on to regurgitate the same arguments that at the beginning of the video you said you don't find persuasive, as they don't even get you to a God. How is it that these same arguments suddenly are persuasive?
And I'll tell you this other thing. This is going a little bit beyond this point in the narrative, but I actually started writing a commentary of Genesis. It ended up being over 500 pages long.
Oh my goodness.
It is basically study notes. It's questions and answers. And I asked every question that I could think of about the book of Genesis as I went through it. And some days I would spend like over an hour.
Is this work available anywhere? I'd really like to see how you incorporate evolution into the creation story, whether you believe there was a literal global flood. Was there a literal Tower of Babel? If so, why is there no evidence of Babylonian artifacts all over the globe? If not, how did you decide which parts are literal history and which parts are not? If Genesis isn't history, what is it? Myth? Allegory? So many questions with no answers.
Writing out answers. And I was able to answer every single one.
Cool. Start with the ones I just gave you. How could you possibly look at the book and believe it the way the ancient Hebrews did? They believed the earth was flat and that the sun revolved around the earth. And the stories in the Bible were literal history. Some modern Christians believe that too. How do you decide which modern Christians have the correct theology?
You actually will not understand, and you won't believe it as well if you haven't asked the questions and learned the answers. So, like, okay, I'll give you a good example of that. Why was Sarah, when she was captured by the second Abimelech, right? In Genesis 20, I think it is. Why was she sexually attractive to him? She was 100. She was 90 years old.
I have seen some beautiful older women. My husband still finds me attractive, just in a different way. I would not consider a man under 40 as a sex partner, as I would see anyone under 40 as too young. Maybe Abimelech was older and found older women attractive. When I played Greedfall, you can romance several of the characters, but not the only one that I would have wanted, Petrus, the old man. He was too old for the main character and like a father to her, but not to me. To me, he was the only one old enough that I would consider as a mate.
Right? That doesn't make any sense at all. Well, okay, I thought about it. Well, there's different theories about that. I read different commentaries. There's free commentaries online that are nicely organized, so it wasn't that much work. And I came up with the following answer, which I haven't heard very much, but I think it's pretty persuasive.
All right.
Look, there was a miracle that God promised, right? That she would conceive and bear a child at age 90. Well, how is that possible? How would it happen? Well, there's two different ways for that to happen. Either her womb was rejuvenated, or the whole woman was rejuvenated. I say the whole woman was rejuvenated.
And that's how you find truth. Think of an answer that, no matter how implausible, but you like it, and that's it. That's the answer. Truth is whatever I want it to be, and when I can't find plausible answers to my questions, I just make stuff up, including divine interventions, extra-biblical miracles, and voila! I arrive at a theology that I like, and I made it up or took it from someone else that made it up, and now it's truth. It's reality. I like it, so it must be right. Sheesh, man. Try applying a bit of reason. Why not throw in a few unicorns for them to ride on while you're at it? After all, this isn't theology, it's fantasy.
And now, the Bible doesn't say that. It's very, very telegraphic, which means it only says the minimum necessary for you to be able to piece the story together properly.
Translation. God didn't write the whole truth. He gives you bits and pieces, so you can fill in the details with a fan fiction, and then declare your fan fiction to be the proper Word of God. And again, I love the expression on Sean's face. I'm not sure he's buying this either. Sanger is so far in the weeds that even Sean isn't up for the journey.
Right? So you ask that question, and it becomes then, it's, you can see that she was entirely rejuvenated. She was made sexually attractive to Abimelech, the king. And that's how that's actually why that story appears there, right? Because I mean, it's a weird interpolation, right? Another Abimelech story. Some scholars think that it shouldn't be there.
But we don't listen to the scholars, right? Because Bible scholars don't know how to read the Bible, right? And again, I don't think Sean is buying this.
That it was evidence, actually, of there being different textual sources. It's cited in support of the documentary hypothesis. That's BS. It's wrong. The reason is that Sarah was being shown to be sexually attractive, and this had to have happened at exactly the time when she conceived.
Right, because extra biblical miracles are far more plausible than a scribe putting a story where it doesn't belong. After all, we only have numerous places where we know scribes have done this, like the long ending of Mark, the story of the woman caught in adultery, just to name two. But believing what we know humans to have done to the text is less plausible and less reasonable than making up a miracle and sticking that into the story, even when it wasn't already there. Larry, you are doing exactly what the scribes did. You are adding to the story what you think belongs, showing more proof that the Bible is nothing but a human book. If there really were a God that cared so much about what people believe about him, that he would send them to eternal torture or annihilation, whatever you view as hell, for not getting the theology right, and then expecting them to make up the parts of the theology that are missing from the story, isn't at all reasonable. Your view, as you have admitted, is an extreme minority view. If getting to truth is making up miracles to shoehorn into the text when the text doesn't make sense on its own, then there is no such thing as truth. I could just as easily make up that Abimelech just liked older women, or that God made an illusion so that only Abimelech saw Sarah as young and attractive. If we just make stuff up and that's what's true and what happened, then the story is different for different readers. There is no real theology.
Right? And so, yes, it's illustrating. But you wouldn't know that if you didn't ask the hard question. So nobody thinks about this. Now, I actually think you have to do this with every part of the Bible.
Amen.
If you don't really carefully analyze the Bible, you're not going to learn all the things that there is.
All the things that there is? This is live, so it's easy to misspeak or make a grammatical error like this and not realize it. But seriously, you have to do this to all of the Bible? So the way to fix the Galilee-Jerusalem problem as to where Jesus was seeing his followers after the resurrection between Luke and Matthew and John could really be the Pegasus that takes the disciples to Galilee and back in a single day? Whenever we find a contradiction in the Bible, we just make something up that can fix the problem. In theater, they call that deus ex machina.
And the thing, to get back to the point, the thing that I discovered is that when you ask the hard questions and you really try to get to faithful answers, the answers of the sort that the people who believed the text had in mind, the original recipients, the smartest of them, what they understood, what they had in mind, then you will discover all sorts of things that you can't see in the text. And this is the only proper way to understand the Bible, and it's the way to make the Bible the most persuasive.
The way to make the Bible persuasive is to add things to the text to make it make sense, because God was incapable of writing himself or inspiring others to write what was needed. God needs everyone to help him make his word persuasive by adding to the text whatever it is you need to find it persuasive. See? Everyone can be persuaded by this text. They just need to rewrite it for themselves. Problem solved. Okay, problem solved, but also no God needed. You also get everyone having their own theology depending on what they added to the text to make it work. Finally, if you have to add to the text to make it make sense, isn't that an admission that the text doesn't make sense?
I love hearing you say this more than I can describe, Larry, because I've heard from so many people growing up that ask questions like you did. I was a question asker, and my dad was like, let's talk about it. Tell me your questions, was not threatened by doubts. So many people afraid to ask questions turned away and understandably don't feel welcome in the church.
Probably because most pastors aren't comfortable with just making stuff up on the spot, or they lack the imagination to do that, or They have enough respect for the intelligence of the congregation that they know that they are likely to call bullshit if they just start making stuff up and reading it into the text.
You talk about an experiment of talking to God. What was that experiment and why did you do it?
So, okay, so I told you how when I was a child, I prayed, and a lot of times my prayers took the form of me saying to God and then just imagining what God would say in response. But even as a child, I remember this, I didn't think that God was speaking to me in response. I know there's a lot of people who think that is true. It's not true. You're just using your imagination. And if it's based on the Bible, it's much more likely. Now, it's possible. It's possible that the Holy Spirit is actually guiding you in imagining the answers.
Thank you for acknowledging that this is just you imagining the answers. The fact that no one ever hears anything other than what they already know is pretty strong evidence of that. But that you are directed to think about something in the Bible as being the response is further evidence that it's coming from within you, not from an outside source. If you don't need to direct that response, then it's more likely to be coming from an outside source.
I sometimes had like deep, mostly moral questions for myself, needed sort of moral guidance. And so I would imagine a wise, this is going to be kind of strange, but I'll tell you anyway. I imagined a white-haired individual appearing outside my window in a floating car.
Okay.
It was just a way to make it
All right.
interesting.
Sure.
Okay.
But God isn't interesting if we don't make him interesting?
There was never a time when I said, well, no, I'm talking to God now. No, I just, that sort of turned into prayer. Like at first I was talking to God about the details of philosophical arguments. And, it was often things like when I got into Psalms, like Psalm 19, I think, and 121, I believe, so some of the Psalms are very philosophical. And not just there, other places too, just sort of like almost casual asides, you start analyzing and just start asking questions about them as I was doing. It's like it placed things into a new perspective. And so again, I had these sorts of imagined conversations.
At this point, you were still aware that this was your imagination. At what point and how did you become convinced that what you imagined was real?
I continue to have these sorts of imagined conversations.
Okay.
I am not a prophet. I do not claim that the things that I imagine God saying in response are actually said by God to me. No. I insist, in fact, that it's just my imagination.
Cool. So why think any of Christianity is true?
But I do think that the more that we read the Bible, the more that we understand doctrine, the more accurate our imagined answers will be.
Why is that? It's still just your imagination. I can imagine realistic things, like a puppy chasing a kitten around a tree. Why do you think your imagined answers to your philosophical questions really are a real God, and specifically the Christian God, and that is closer to truth than my puppy chasing the kitten? Both come from our imaginations. Both are possible. Mine is far more plausible, but neither are real. Both are merely imaginary. How does this get you to a God being real?
In other words, to put this, if you don't want to talk about play pretend, this isn't play pretend, this is serious pretend.
How so? You are just pretending. Just because you are pretending serious things doesn't take it out of the realm of play. I can pretend a tsunami wipes out the entire western seaboard. This would be a very serious matter, but it's still just pretend. It isn't real.
If you don't want to put it in terms of play pretend, the point is, we have to imagine what God would say to us.
Exactly. You have hit the nail on the head. No actual God is going to talk to you, to reveal anything to you. It's all in your head, all in your imagination. So please, why, for the love of Pete, do you think that your imagination is actually true?
In other words, what the creator of the universe actually thinks about the about various things going on in our lives, or thoughts in our heads, and so forth. We have to allow God to interrogate us.
If such a person exists, I don't think that he, she, they, it care about what I think. The fact that such a person hasn't made its presence known in any demonstrable way is clear evidence that if such a creature person exists, it doesn't care at all about us. We are no more to it than any other creature on this planet. Perhaps this God knows that we will further evolve into a kinder, gentler, and more intelligent species, and it's waiting for that species to evolve, as that one is far more interesting than we are.
Essentially, imagine it. But unless you root that in the Bible and, understand the Bible and doctrine, which is to say what you can infer reliably from the Bible, then your answers are going to be half-baked a lot of times.
I find all of what you have said to be half-baked. If you imagine things based on the Bible, that they are likely to be true, bullshit. You've imagined it. It isn't real.
It's one of the things the new atheists would do is they would go surface deep on the Bible and go slavery, misogyny, genocide, God is terrible. And those are fair objections that we need to respond to.
If those are fair objections, then you need to respond to them. Why do you consider them to be a surface-level reading of the Bible? Earlier, your guest said not to listen to Bible scholars because none of them know how to understand it as people who believe do. So if one is not to go too deep into study of the Bible and become a scholar, and not just read the surface, as you claim many atheists do, what is the right way to understand the Bible, and why is that the right way? It seems that the two of you advocate for a strong lay understanding of the Bible, which is exactly what I have. Not only have I read the Bible several times, I've also read N.T. Wright, C.S. Lewis, Kellerman, Piper, Grudem, MacArthur, Knowles, Sturgis, and so many more. If that isn't the right kind of stuff, what is? If I can read all of that and come away an atheist, where do you propose the problem lies? I no longer believe any of it because I no longer presuppose it to be true while reading it. And that seems to be exactly what Sanger is saying one must do in order to, as he would claim, see it properly. But if you have to presuppose it to be true in order for it to seem reasonable or plausible, can you honestly say that it really is? When I look at a car, if I presuppose it to look like a horse, I can do that, but it's still a car. If you have to tell yourself that this is true to make it be plausible, is that not evidence that it's not plausible?
How do you reconsider them? Do you think the arguments are good now?
Yes, I do think the arguments are much better now.
The arguments didn't change. At the beginning, you said you didn't find these persuasive.
I still think that. It's true. It doesn't follow.
Not that you didn't in the past, but that you don't find that they get you to the Christian God. Did you change your mind about that during the course of this show?
I think that you have to proportion the strength of each individual conclusion to the premises of that particular argument. So all that the argument from contingency establishes is that a necessary being exists.
No, it claims to establish that. This probably isn't the best explanation of the argument. It's Frank Turek's. But you said we are supposed to listen to people who already believe as you do, and not scholars, so Frank qualifies. Right out of the gate, the first premise is everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. I don't believe the first premise. It's entirely possible that things exist for which there is no explanation. Black holes, antimatter, quantum physics, just to name a few. I don't know that there will ever be explanations of such things. So much for the contingency argument.
I still try to be intellectually humble, so maybe there is a reason to immediately leap to the conclusion God exists on that basis.
That is not the intellectually humble position. The intellectually humble position is that maybe that argument isn't true.
A bird flies outside my window, I expect to see an explanation of that. Well, it hatched from an egg, and this is what birds do. Birds, maybe they evolved, or maybe they came from somewhere, and they're part of this whole system. And ultimately, you trace causes back to an initial cause. And the bird also at a different level follows different laws, and those laws can be rooted and explained in terms of some fundamental laws and so forth. You expect an explanation of all of these things. You certainly expect an explanation of why the bird flew by my window at that moment. You think there's a reason that makes that necessary, right? Well, why isn't that true of the entire universe and everything that's in it?
Why expect that at all? Why does there have to be an explanation? Maybe there is none. Certainly there are explanations for some things, like the bird came from an egg and birds are descendants of dinosaurs and so forth. But that we have explanations for some things doesn't mean that there is an explanation for everything.
Right? Including the laws and the constants and so forth. That would be a necessary being.
Why? Even if there is a necessary cause, there is no need for that cause to be a being. The only way to get to a being is to presuppose it. And if you have to presuppose the conclusion, then there is no necessary being. Your argument has failed. It has established nothing. Unfortunately, he doesn't explore this at all.
What was it like when you all of a sudden just thought, okay, I'm a believer? And was there a sense where you had a realization of the weight of your sin as a part of that conversion?
I decided to take seriously the possibility that I had been wrong about that. And when I started investigating that question.
Interesting. When I took seriously the possibility that I had been wrong about Christianity, I no longer believed. What convinced him to go the other way?
Wrote about it, the more I became convinced that the case for the cumulative case for the existence of God really was stronger than otherwise. So if I was going to make up my mind, I'm going to go ahead and do it. But yeah, the thing that I can barely comprehend myself at this point is why I abandoned methodological skepticism to that extent.
A very good question. Could it be that you just wanted it to be true? Sanger never does answer Sean's question about whether he had any realization of sin in his life. At no point does he ever mention Jesus or an atonement or a resurrection. Does he believe in such things? How about hell? Is hell real? Is it unbelief? Or is it torture or annihilation if it even exists? Sanger answers none of these questions, which is why I conclude that Christians, like Sean, are getting desperate to try to find converts to counter a few of the deconversion stories you hear all over YouTube, with a few conversion stories. Yet when they trot out converts like A.N. Hersey Alley or Larry Sanger here, we get a bunch of squishy, to borrow Avery's word from last week, watered-down Christianity that they converted to that doesn't even need to include Jesus. Can you even call this Christianity? If Christ isn't necessary anymore to be a Christian, what even is a Christian? One last comment that puts it all in perspective.
Did it matter that there were, Christians that I knew and loved, admired, respected. Of course, actually, that mattered a lot. And if I didn't have any good examples of that sort, I'm sure I never would have taken the faith seriously.
He wasn't convinced by any arguments. Rather, he took Christian faith seriously because there were people he knew and loved that did. Was this a case of peer pressure? Who knows? What I do know is Larry has given us no reason to take his faith seriously, and no reason to even think that he is a Christian. How is one a Christian when one's conversion has nothing to do with believing in Jesus or atonement for sin? If Christianity is now just believing whatever the hell you want to believe and calling yourself a Christian, maybe everyone's a Christian. Maybe this was God's plan to reach all of mankind and get everyone to believe. Just believe whatever you want to believe, and that is being a Christian. What I would really like to know is whether after this interview, Sean thinks that Larry is a Christian or not. Live your life.
But you made it. Have a cookie.